Good evening and welcome to the CUNY Graduate Center and welcome to the CUNY Forum. I'm Professor Ed Rogowsky, Director of the CUNY Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. This is a special edition of the CUNY Forum. It's a program planned and developed and presented by the Gotham Center for New York History Forum, the topic of which is From the Third Degree to Abner Louima, the history of police violence in New York City since the 1880s. I'm happy to introduce to you the faculty member who will moderate this evening's discussion. He is Pulitzer Prize-winning co-author of Gotham, The History of New York City. He's a professor at John Jay College of City University and the Graduate Center, Professor Mike Wallace, and he will introduce to you the members of the panel.
Hello, I'm Mike Wallace. I'm the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening, which is also the latest in a series of history forums that we've been putting on over the past year. All right, now tonight's discussion is called From the Third Degree to Abner Louima, a history of police violence in New York City since the 1880s. We chose the term police violence as I at least think that the term police brutality is seriously problematic in that it implicitly suggests that violent confrontations between officers and civilians stem from characterological or psychological traits of the men and women in blue. Now, I've taught cops at John Jay College of Criminal Justice for nearly 30 years now. And I know that not only is such a characterization not helpful, but in fact it's positively, I think, counterproductive in that it distracts attention from what are the deeper causes that we should be contending with, which is to say the things that the dominant forces of the larger cultural, social, economic, and political order have called upon the police to do. We'll see if the panel agrees or if you agree. Our panel tonight, and I'm going to make the introductions to for everybody at once, is as follows. We have, going in order across the room, Lynn Johnson, who is an assistant professor of history at Boston College, and our thanks to her for having schlepped all the way down from Boston for this. She teaches urban and working class history. Recently, she authored Gender, Race, and Rumors, Re-examining the 1943 Race Riots, an article in Gender and History. And she's currently working on a book about the history of police violence in New York City that will run from the 1860s down through the 1960s. Tonight, she'll start us off with a discussion situating our issue in the late 19th to early 20th century. Then we'll go to Martha Biondi, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at Northwestern Universities. Our thanks to her for an even longer schlep in to New York City. Her Columbia doctoral dissertation was on, quote, the struggle for black equality in New York City, 1945 to 1955, and it was nominated for the Columbia University Bancroft Prize as well as the Allen Nevins Prize given by the Society for American Historians. It's going to be published by Harvard University Press next year. She will talk about the 1940s and the 1950s. John Rudolph will cover the same territory, but as you heard fleetingly from another kind of perspective. John is an independent radio producer. He's produced prize-winning reports and programs for many of the world's leading radio networks, including NPR, BBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and CBS. He's doing a show on police violence for WNYC, where he formerly served as the station's news director and as host of City Edition, a call-in program on city politics. He's going to play some excerpts from the archival tapes covering the 50s and 60s that he's going to be using in his program. Ron Daniels is a longtime organizer and political activist. He was deputy campaign manager for Jesse Jackson's 1988 bid for the presidency, and he played a leading role in the National African American Leadership Summit. He is currently executive director of the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, which has launched a national police accountability initiative. He's also a contributor to Jill Nelson's recent book, Police Brutality, an anthology. and he will tackle the 1970s through 1990s. And then Norman Siegel, who is, as he likes to say, not only executive director of the New York Civil Liberties Union, but a proud troublemaker, has been involved for a long time in the police violence issue on Mayor Giuliani's ill-fated task force on police community relations. Each of our panelists will talk for about 10 to 15 minutes. We'll have a brief opportunity for the panelists to comment on other panelists, and then we'll go to you in the audience for questions and comments, and we'll wrap things up at 8:30. Thanks so much for coming.
The recent high-profile cases of police brutality in New York, while alarming, are certainly nothing new. In the African-American community, police violence has been a persistent problem throughout the 20th century and a focal point for community mobilization since at least the 1940s. People my age and older no doubt remember the many controversial cases of police violence against African Americans, Latinos, and student radicals in the 60s and 70s. Some of you may even remember the bloody battles between police and communists in Union Square and City Hall Park during the Depression years of the 1930s. The problem, however, is even older than that, as I've discovered. New Yorkers have been filing complaints against the excessive use of force by police since the founding of the force in 1845. What does this long history of police violence tell us about our current dilemma? What lessons can we learn from the past? In some areas, history offers encouraging news. As most historians of policing agree, police conduct in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was in many ways more violent and undisciplined than it is today. Under pressure from legal reformers, civil liberties groups, and the press, the NYPD has significantly reduced some of its overtly violent practices of the past. In terms of crowd control, for example, wholesale beatings of political protesters, like those administered to communists in the 1930s, are no longer acceptable police practice. Likewise, the violent treatment of criminal suspects during police interrogation, the notorious third degree that was so common during the 1920s and 30s, has been significantly reduced thanks to increased judicial scrutiny and Miranda. But other forms of police brutality have been more stubborn. Street brutality, that common type of violence occurring incident to arrest, has been a persistent and seemingly intractable problem since the mid-19th century. Vocal criticism of police clubbers began in the 1860s and reemerged episodically over the next century. Public alarm over brutality often coincided with police corruption scandals, which, as historians have pointed out, tend to recur in about 20-year cycles. The current scandal surrounding the crash unit in the Ramparts district of Los Angeles is a prime example of the interconnections between brutality and corruption. In New York, the Mullen Commission investigation of the early 90s made similar connections and set the stage for the subsequent controversies surrounding the Louima, Diallo, and Dorsman cases. Public campaigns against brutality and corruption, it seemed to go hand in hand. The history of police brutality in New York, however, suggests that this relationship between brutality and corruption is a complicated and paradoxical one. In many cases, corruption scandals opened the door for victims and critics of police brutality and brought new drives for police professionalization and reform. In practice, however, such reform campaigns rarely addressed the issue of excessive force and in some cases even encouraged it in the interest of efficient crime fighting. The relationship between police corruption and brutality has been a paradoxical one. On the one hand, corruption scandals and investigations have generally weakened police credibility, making the department vulnerable to criticism of all sorts. Public hearings that have accompanied those investigations have opened the doors to a broad spectrum of New Yorkers who could now air their complaints about police harassment and brutality in a safe context. On the other hand, most anti-corruption reformers have not been terribly interested in the problem of brutality. Police honesty and efficiency were their main objectives. Those forms of violence that were linked to corrupt behavior or political prejudice have been reduced, but the most common type of brutality caused by overzealous enforcement and/or racism was either left unaddressed or tacitly sanctioned in the interest of efficient crime fighting. It should come as no surprise, then, that the city's current mayor, who made his career as a crusader against organized crime and corruption, has been the architect of a style of policing that has produced so much controversy and litigation. Thank you.
Good evening.
Pull the mic up.
The title of this talk is Black Migration and the Expansion of Constitutional Rights. After World War II, there was an explosion of police violence against black people in New York City. From 1947 to 1952, 46 unarmed African Americans and 2 whites were killed by police officers in the state of New York. This correlated with a sharp jump in the city's black population, rising black income, and the beginnings of the civil rights movement. In the 1940s, the black population of the city grew 62%, from less than 500,000 to over 1 million, giving New York the largest urban black population in the world. World War II generated full employment and the biggest jump in black earnings since emancipation. Southern migrants with high expectations were demanding the right to live and work anywhere, and to patronize downtown nightclubs and restaurants. As black New Yorkers were renegotiating urban space and laying siege to old boundaries, police officers moved to the front lines of defending white supremacy. Complaints of police brutality poured into NACP offices. Struggles for police reform and defendants' rights are not usually associated with the civil rights movement, but they were a major component. In the early 1960s, several federal court rulings extended the Bill of Rights to state criminal proceedings, ensuring indigent defendants the right to counsel and barring the use of evidence from unlawful police searches. These decisions were not divorced from the movement, but flowed from it. Like other judicial rulings that have expanded American liberalism, they were not isolated innovations of great legal minds, but achievements of a grassroots struggle for social justice. Much like today, post-war activists did not just react to police violence, they analyzed it and developed a comprehensive strategy to stop it. There were grassroots campaigns to win state laws barring the use of evidence from coerced confessions and warrantless searches, as well as a law to end police immunity from criminal prosecution. Activists struggled to get an independent civilian complaint review board and a permanent special prosecutor to handle allegations of brutality. In individual cases, activist attorneys fought for justice through local channels. But by 1950, repeated failures made them turn to the U.S. Justice Department for federal prosecution. The major legacy of the movement was its critique of states' rights and insistence on the right of recourse to federal authorities in the U.S. Constitution. When black workers in Harlem took to the streets during the Depression, demanding jobs in their own community, the city responded with intensified police surveillance. According to Langston Hughes, police on horseback patrolled the area en masse, making Harlem the only city neighborhood with mounted police. Anger over the massive police presence fueled the riot in Harlem in 1943. Black New Yorkers suffered disproportionately from a wide range of police abuse, including indiscriminate searches, station house beatings, and coerced confessions. In 1945, residents of Brownsville, Brooklyn reported that it was, quote, impossible for men to be walking the streets at night in parts of the Negro section without being stopped for questioning or being searched. They claimed that local police officers routinely beat black men with baseball bats and rubber hoses while they were in police custody. In 1947, after mobilizing around several cases of police violence, activists won a board of review composed equally of police and civilians, including ministers and civil rights leaders. But the police commissioner tried to block any meaningful investigations, and the group soon dissolved. This revealed an enduring lesson. The police department would fight change all the way and would try to sabotage even small reforms. In the next few years, the Harlem and Brooklyn NAACP branches engaged in intensive campaigns against police brutality. The state NAACP passed a resolution deploring, quote, the rampant false arrests, unlawful entries, framings, and illegal convictions, and the exoneration of guilty officers of the law, and demanded a state law removing police officer immunity from criminal prosecution. The NAACP branches also lobbied the city to establish an independent committee where citizens could bring complaints of police misconduct. Harlem State Assembly members Hewlin Jack and Elijah Crum pushed a bill in Albany barring the admissibility of evidence obtained from an unlawful search. Although illegally obtained evidence was already barred in federal courts, the Supreme Court did not apply the exclusionary rule to state criminal courts until 1961. The New York State Constitution had prohibited unreasonable search and seizure in 1938, but it refrained from excluding any evidence acquired through such a search. The Brooklyn NAACP petitioned Governor Thomas Dewey, demanding a special prosecutor for several cases of police brutality and murder. In one case, the police had invaded the home of a young migrant from North Carolina and killed him in front of his wife. Quote, "Aren't the police supposed to be the protectors of the home?" his widow asked. The NAACP petition listed the following abuses: unjustified physical assaults, illegal entries, searches and seizures, third-degree practices in police station houses, extortion, and perjuries. These acts are not occasionally committed, the NAACP lawyers wrote. They are practiced frequently and unremittingly. The petition analyzed why the worst police abuses fell overwhelmingly on black residents. Quote, "Perhaps the facts are so because of racial prejudices, because of attitudes of white superiority, because of the assumption that Negroes have little means to protest and resist and fight back, because of the knowledge that no law enforcement official or agency gives attention to the complaints of Negroes against police officers." The movement's biggest goal was to change that, to make the police know that they were public servants and that black citizens would take their complaints to political leaders. The migrant generation was determined to remake their world and alter patterns of racial subordination and control. Their drive to stop police brutality was part of the struggle for first-class citizenship. In 1949, the movement won a seeming concession from City Hall. The mayor appointed a 3-person committee to investigate charges of police brutality in Brooklyn, but the committee refused to hold hearings and hear the victims' accounts and relied instead on police evidence alone. NAACP branches picketed City Hall, claiming that the committee served as political cover for the upcoming mayoral election. Harlem came close to a riot in December 1950 after 2 white police officers shot and killed an unarmed black Korean war veteran on 119th Street and 8th Avenue. Wounded in action, 24-year-old John Derrick had been discharged 12 hours before his murder and was still in uniform when he died. Nothing happened to the police officers. It took a threat of rioting and violence by Congressman Adam Clayton Powell to even have them transferred from the community. Powell appealed for federal prosecution of the officers for violating John Derrick's constitutional rights. The post-war anti-lynching struggle had increased the authority of the federal government to prosecute civil rights violations, a late victory in light of the decline in lynching, but one that became a weapon in the struggle against police brutality. According to Powell, the FBI's investigation of the Derrick shooting was the first such instance of federal intervention in a northern state. Quote, "We don't call them that, but we do have lynchings right here in the North," Powell said. Quote, "If a lynch mob can be investigated in Georgia, the murder of a Negro by 2 police officers in New York should be investigated." However, after hearing only police testimony, a federal grand jury declined to indict the officers. From this point forward, the NAACP decided to regularly seek federal intervention to stop the epidemic of police violence in New York. They also pursued a new strategy of filing civil suits. As one activist said, quote, "In criminal cases, police enjoy almost complete immunity in the courts. By filing both civil and criminal suits at the same time, we have a much better chance of checking brutality," end quote. Advocates hoped that the prospect of paying large settlements would push the city to restrain police behavior. In 1952, there were 10 lawsuits against the city for police brutality. The city won 5, the plaintiffs 4, and 1 was settled. The city paid over $200,000 in damages, but all the losing police officers remained on the city payroll, were never charged with crimes nor subjected to internal discipline. In 1951, the city council representative from Harlem introduced a bill calling for the dismissal of police officers in civil cases that had cost the taxpayers money. Quote, "These officers must be made to learn that all Negroes are not criminals," he declared. But the bill was defeated, and civil liabilities against a police officer still have no formal connection to his or her employment status. The post-war campaign against police brutality culminated in the early 1950s after an attempt by the NYPD to block federal oversight of the constitutional rights of New Yorkers. Officials from the NYPD and the U.S. Justice Department made a secret illegal agreement that the FBI would not investigate allegations of civil rights violations by New York police officers. The New York City Police Commissioner told a federal agent that civil rights laws only applied, quote, "south of the Mason-Dixon line." The deal came to an end after the police beating of a 31-year-old black truck driver named Jacob Jackson in August 1952. Jackson, along with his wife Geneva Jackson and a friend Samuel Crawford, said they were arrested near their home on the west side of Manhattan because, quote, they didn't move along fast enough upon a police order to do so. Jacob Jackson and Crawford were severely beaten in the station house. Jackson underwent 2 surgical operations on his skull, and metal plates were inserted in his head. An attorney with the Harlem branch of the NAACP pushed the case hard, filing a $100,000 civil suit and appealing to federal authorities. In the course of the FBI's investigation, higher-ups in the Justice Department discovered the illicit agreement and terminated it. A press expose of the deal created a major scandal, leading to a flood of complaints against the NYPD to the Justice Department and a congressional investigation. Ella Baker of the New York branch of the NAACP announced that they might seek federal action in over 100 cases from the past 30 months, and 20 complaints were immediately turned over to the U.S. Attorney. But after a federal grand jury failed to indict the police officers in the Jacob Jackson case, it became clear that police officers had considerable power and protection in federal courts as well. In fact, none of the new complaints led to an indictment of a police officer. Local protests and political mobilization, however, did put pressure on city leaders to adopt the appearance of reform. In what was billed as a major breakthrough, the NYPD created a civilian complaint review board in 1953, but it was composed entirely of police department personnel. The commissioner even appointed one of the officials who had made the illegal deal with the Justice Department. He was now put in charge of precisely the type of investigation he had sought to block. Civil rights leaders were outraged with the outcome of the scandal. Making the CCRB independent of the NYPD became their next major goal. Activists did not succeed in ending racial violence or civil rights violations by New York City police officers, but their efforts constituted an important part of the creation of international human rights standards in the decolonizing world. In 1952, movement radicals, including William Patterson and Paul Robeson, presented a petition to the United Nations called We Charge Genocide, that sought to use the United Nations Charter to stop racial violence in the United States. The post-war movement identified issues that continue to be the goals of the anti-police brutality struggle in New York and elsewhere. They include protection from unreasonable search and seizure, a halt to coerced confessions, the creation of a truly independent civilian complaint review board, the arrest and trial of police officers accused of brutality, greater diversity in the department, and an end to the media stereotyping of black men as criminals. Today, attacks on affirmative action and black voting rights are happening at the same time as an epidemic of police violence, a sharp increase in incarceration, the erosion of defendants' rights, and the spread of racialized policing. The connection between these different forms of backlash becomes clearer when we understand that criminal justice reforms and civil rights gains were historically connected. They were part of the same struggle. Finally, winning the right to appeal to the federal government was a hard-fought victory of the early civil rights movement. But while winning broader authority for federal intervention was crucial, the new rules did not by themselves lead to federal action. Urban uprisings, grassroots protests, and political pressure have played outsized roles in triggering federal prosecutions. Our challenge is to make federal oversight a weapon to achieve genuine reforms in police procedure nationwide, and to make civilian complaint review boards, community-based organizations, accountable to the people rather than the police.
Thank you, Martha. John Rudolph.
Martha, in her talk, spoke about this secret deal that the NYPD made with the U.S. Justice Department. Police Commissioner, George P. Monahan, had gone to the Justice Department in 1952 seeking this exemption whereby New York City police officers who were accused of violating civil rights of citizens were exempt from the normal Justice Department procedure, which was that they would be questioned by FBI agents. New York was the only place in the country that had this exemption, and Commissioner Monahan asked for the exemption because he said that constant questioning by FBI agents of police officers accused of excessive force was demoralizing the police force. Then, as Martha explained, the existence of this deal was made public in an article in the World Telegram, and then many other papers picked this up. And on February 22nd, 1953, Commissioner Monahan went on NBC radio and television. They gave him a half hour to state his case. And what he did is he denied the existence of this secret deal, despite the fact that there was ample evidence that it existed. And here is an excerpt from that speech by Commissioner Monahan.
A week ago, somebody reported that your New York Police Department and the United States Department of Justice had quietly entered into an agreement on July 11, 1952, to bypass the FBI when investigating complaints of police brutality. The deal, it was said, was for the police department to investigate itself so that it would be exempted from the federal civil rights law. That is a lie. It's an outright lie, and nothing is further from the facts. I unequivocally deny that any such illegal agreement, pact, deal, or understanding was ever made. I deny that such an agreement ever existed, directly or even by implication. It is of the utmost importance that this issue be fully resolved, for in my honest judgment, the occurrences of this past week are serving to undermine and destroy the efficiency and the morale of those who have taken a sacred oath to protect you, even if it should be at the cost of their own lives.
So a clearly angry police commissioner denying these charges. Now, on that same day, there was another program, radio program, on CBS, on the CBS program Let's Find Out. And the title of the program was, "Is the Police Department Really Covering Up Brutality Cases?" It was moderated by Edward P. Morgan, a veteran CBS newsman. And one of the guests was Bruce Smith, the acting director of the Institute of Public Administration, who in February, in 1952, a year earlier than this broadcast, had issued a scathing report about how the police department, not only about excessive use of police force, but of the entire administration of the NYPD. And so Bruce Smith was asked by Edward P. Morgan about the issue of police brutality, and here is an excerpt from that program.
Now, let's start finding out. Is the police department really covering up in brutality cases? Mr. Smith, that question is aimed directly at you.
Well, Mr. Morgan, I won't keep you in suspense for the answer. It is, and it has been, for the past 15 years, or perhaps a little bit more. The process has been of slow growth. It started, I suppose, in the most reasonable kind of an effort to protect the department from unfavorable publicity in cases that might not be too well founded or established. But it has gone on from there to the point where the disciplinary system of the department has broken down, where the disciplinary cases run only 10% of what they were running back in 1933 or thereabouts. The result is that police captains are not citing their men for derelictions, either because they don't want to or because they have been discouraged by the small penalties imposed and by the delays which have grown up whenever the department's policy was seriously challenged.
Now, the remarkable thing about both of these programs that I've played you excerpts from is that while the uncovering this secret deal was prompted by this incident where two black citizens of New York were dragged into a station house on the West Side and severely beaten. The two men were actually handcuffed together in the station house and then beaten by police. That neither the police chief nor Mr. Smith, the advocate of reform, mentioned They did more than give lip service to the racial dimension of this. It was really they were talking about police administration and not the racial dimension. And that's a theme that you see, I think, throughout the 1950s. Now, I'd like to go ahead to 1959, September 3rd, 1959, another era, a different mayor. This is Mayor Wagner now. The city was experiencing a wave of gang violence, and Governor Nelson Rockefeller called a summit to talk about what the city could do to stop this wave of gang violence. Members of gangs were killing each other in the Lower East Side, in Brooklyn, and they wanted to find a solution for this. And so Mayor Wagner was interviewed on WNYC by a very young Gabe Pressman, whose voice you won't hear on this particular recording, but he was asked about the question of police use of nightsticks. And I think that what you will hear here is a change in attitude toward a more balanced attitude towards the use of police force, and perhaps a moving away from certainly the attitude that was expressed in the LaGuardia tape that you heard earlier.
On the question of the nightsticks, I think a lot of people fail to realize that the police department on the 4 in the afternoon to 12 shift at night and from the 12 to the 8 o'clock shift carry nightsticks, and they have been carrying them for a number of years. And the orders to the police department is that they preserve law and order, that they are to use force if necessary in carrying out their responsibilities. Plus, we got to realize, too, that they are controlled by laws, and they must act according to the law. We want to see these hoodlums off the streets of New York. We want to see an air of peace and understanding here in our city. But we also have to be sure that they do not be accused of police brutality at the same time.
So that's Mayor Robert Wagner speaking in 1959. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to jump ahead and just say that despite Mayor Wagner's more balanced view and his association with the civil rights movement, in 1964 there was a riot in Harlem, and the police actions during that riot spurred a call for a civilian review board. John Lindsay ran on a platform of instituting a civilian review board, and shortly after he was elected in 1965, he introduced his new police commissioner. Edward Leary came from Philadelphia, had worked with a civilian review board, was one of the only big city police commissioners who had done that. Here's an excerpt from John Lindsay introducing his new police commissioner.
I campaigned on the issue of a police review board. Let me review what this means. Let's remove it from the atmosphere of accusation and counter-accusation, which has surrounded me since last summer. I plan to install a police review board within the police department. It will consist of 3 police officers and 4 of the city's outstanding civilians. These men will be trained in due process and the laws of evidence. They will be men of great stature within the community. The review board will stay within the police department. The police commissioner will be the ultimate authority. The review board will make its recommendations to Commissioner Leary, and his will be the final word. Now, why has this simple and equitable suggestion been surrounded with passion and arguments? Why have men of sense and stature made the absurd accusation that all of us have heard? The answer to this question is that for the first time in 20 years, a new administration is in charge of the city. Many men who have become entrenched and indifferent in office are about to be disturbed as the winds of change blow through the city government.
Well, the winds of change didn't quite blow through the city government. The Patrolmen's Benevolent Association opposed the imposition of a civilian review board. It never happened, and the rest, as they say, is history. And that's where I'm going to leave you. I'm not going to come up with any grand conclusion other than to say thank you, and I hope you enjoyed listening to these.
Thank you, John. Ron Daniels.
Well, I too like to say good evening to everyone, and I'm struck by we often begin these talks by saying the issue of police brutality is not new in our society, but I'm quite struck by all of the presentations talking about the persistence of a problem within our society. And of course, I was going to end on this, but I'll sort of frame it at the beginning. As in the final analysis, the question becomes, what is the appropriate role for police or policing authorities within a democratic society? This seems to be the key challenge. And one might say a critical subtext, but not an inconsequential one, is the question of the role of police not only within a democratic society, but one which is as diverse as our society is. The Center for Constitutional Rights, which works on issues of using the Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to advance the cause of social justice and social change, actually became deeply involved in our work around police brutality and misconduct earlier in the mid-90s, actually. And let me just say, though I was asked to comment on the 80s, I don't profess or pretend to be conversant about policing policy in New York in the 80s. I'm going to comment really on the work of the center from the vantage point of what we've been doing in the last several years. And the reason why we became involved in police brutality is because we do connect with grassroots organizations and movements, and we were virtually overwhelmed by complaints in the city of New York about police brutality. Now, of course, this is against the backdrop of questions about welfare reform and housing and a range of other issues. But this issue emerged as the #1 issue among grassroots organizations that we were working with, particularly in communities of color and young African American and Latino men. And of course, the complaint was about the Giuliani model of policing, that somehow in this period there had been an intensification of certain tactics that a lot of the young people found horrific and found offensive. Now, of course, as I said before, the question of, though we look at Giuliani and we look at the current situation, it's not new, as we said earlier. I would remind people that the 1968 Kerner Commission report on civil disorders in American society indicated that virtually every one of the rebellions that erupted in the 60s, including the one here in New York, was precipitated by an incident or an allegation of police misconduct or police brutality. So again, particularly in the African American community and in my own life experiences, again, the issue of policing in our communities has been a persistent question. Of course, we saw the Rodney King phenomenon or the Rodney King tragedy. The point I would like to mention about that is an aspect of the problem has been a tremendous credibility gap. That is to say, many of the people in larger society, if I might use that term, or the majority society, are in utter disbelief that police function the way they function in poor communities and communities of color. So if the Rodney King beating had not been captured live on videotape, one wonders whether or not one would have ever believed, or most Americans would have believed it happened at all. And I think in New York, we certainly have encountered that problem also. That is to say that the larger society does not believe that these things are occurring in the way that African Americans and people of color claim they are occurring. So this gap in perceptions between blacks and whites is a critical concern that we have to address. In the most recent period, what I think has been occurring is a variation of themes that have already been identified. And they are, of course, manifest in the New York Police Department. Racial profiling is a term which we've just recently come to grips with in the perhaps last 5 years, the whole phenomenon of driving while black or driving while brown, the whole notion of stopping people simply on the basis of their skin color or the presumption that because one is of a certain race that one is a criminal. Of course, we heard some of that in some of the earlier presentations. This has become perhaps more intensified in this period, or at least people are more angry about it in this period than we might have heard perhaps a few years ago. The other phenomenon is the intensification of the militarization of the police, the use of highly specialized SWAT teams and other kinds of highly militarized units within communities, adopting really a combat methodology, a clear paramilitary methodology of engaging in policing. In New York City, I would draw your attention to one of those units. There are many of them, the narco unit, but the unit which has drawn a great deal of attention because it was the unit out of which the officers who killed Amadou Diallo came, is the street crimes unit. And not only is this question of racial profiling one of just stopping people for driving, it is in some ways the area which has created the greatest amount of concern has been in the stopping and frisking of people. So while we do have these high-profile cases like the Diallo case, the Luima case, and others, which are certainly have drawn tremendous amount of attention to New York City, in some ways it is the day-to-day, low-level warfare that goes on in the streets of New York, particularly in communities of color, that has drawn the most angry reaction. And I just call your attention to the statistic that was published in the New York Times that indicated that between 1997 and 1998, the NYPD recorded or reported some 45,000 stops and frisk of people, largely in communities of color. Of those 45,000, there were only 10,000 arrests. Of those arrests, there were only 5,000 cases were thrown out, which means that 40,000 innocent people by their own records were basically stopped on the basis of a suspicion that was unreasonable, at least in terms of most applications of the Fourth Amendment. Now, I say reported stops because if one remembers the Diallo trial, the officers there were touting the fact that they had stopped other people that night. And when the prosecution asked them where these stops were recorded, they couldn't come up with it. There was no record. And of course, Attorney General Spitzer in his report indicated, therefore, that the stop and frisk policies, aggressive policing in these communities, in fact, may be 2 or 3 or 4 times as high. And if you just use 3 times as many, you're talking about 150,000 people who were stopped and frisked. And so one gets a sense of the kind of anger that can erupt in communities when you have both racial profiling in terms of driving, but also in communities where people are routinely stopped, so much so that many of the young people accept it as a way of life. Oh yeah, I was stopped, 5 times. Or I mean, it's just, it's an exception, adoption or a accommodation to that which we ought not to accommodate. Let me suggest that one of the things that we need to focus on in this period is the issue of drugs in American society. That while I'm sure there have always been different reasons why the police have been out of control in various periods, in this period it seems to me that we have to focus on the war on drugs. The young brothers and sisters in the community have say that the war on drugs is a war on us. That racial profiling, as much of racial profiling is about looking for drugs. Much of the stop and frisk policy is about looking for drugs or looking for the guns that are sometimes associated with the drug trafficking in our communities. Now, this is, of course, not to dismiss the seriousness of this issue, but it is to raise questions about whether or not this society has adopted the appropriate method of dealing with drug addiction and drug trafficking in our society, and I'll make some comments about that in a moment. But I do think we need to focus on this question of the war on drugs. Let me suggest that in a democratic society, what we ought to be striving for is, as Martha suggested, the whole notion of of communities interacting with and being in partnership with and actually controlling the methods and strategies by which their communities will be policed. And we don't obviously see that in the city of New York. What we've had is the adoption of aggressive policing methodologies, quality of life, where the question of someone being a squeegee man is seen as some paramount threat. And even though Commissioner Bratton is credited with having adopted community policing and so forth, I am not persuaded that this whole theory of you have to stop which he embraces and adopts, that you have to stop the petty crimes, because if you do petty crime, it becomes larger crime. So therefore, people who jump over the turnstiles and stuff like that. I mean, I'm not persuaded that is necessarily the way to approach. Not that I'm saying you ought not to do this, but I'm saying that to focus on these things in communities where people are being cast in jail because they have an open can of beer in their community or whatever, therefore get a criminal record, and then they become candidates really for the criminal jail, the prison jail industrial complex, which is where large numbers of people are landing, people of color, and not only landing there but being disenfranchised, so that huge numbers of people in Florida who happen to be African American and Latino could not vote because they had criminal records, for example. But that's another story for another time. Well, there is 4 million. There are 4 million people who are disenfranchised, 1.2 million of whom are African Americans. Let me conclude by saying that we need community policing, authentic community policing as a methodology. The paradigm is one of partnership, and again, the question of looking at the role of policing in American society, and I think that is the appropriate role. The final thing I want to conclude on, however, is what I consider to be an area that is often overlooked. And that is to say that it seems to me over the last 25 years or so, what's been going on is, as you look at the changes in attitude, is that in our society, as our nation has become more conservative in attitude, and there's been a reaction against the question of some of the rights that minorities have achieved, you've had demagogic politicians who have stood on law and order platforms and the war on drugs and a number of other things. And what we have had is the substitution of more prisons, mandatory sentencing, like the Rockefeller drug laws in this state, where you have some 22,000 nonviolent offenders now incarcerated for relatively minor offenses, and more prisons and the death penalty as a substitute for a social, economic, and racial justice, and that we don't focus on that enough. That is to say, there is a real problem with drugs in our society and the problems it created. But rather than deal with the question of social, economic, and racial justice and the programs that are manifest therein, what was adopted was a policing strategy, because that was more popular for politicians like Giuliani and others to play to constituencies who are disenfranchised and to the probable voters and all the stuff that we've heard during the course of this election. Let me conclude this presentation by quoting myself actually from a book on police brutality that Jill Nelson has put together. And it says the following: "It is not enough, however, simply to train police to function differently in our communities as they pursue the mission of maintaining peace and security. The familiar slogan, 'No justice, no peace,' is in reality a formula for crime reduction and the creation of a wholesome and secure communities. Unless and until this nation makes a firm and irreversible commitment to ensure that all the people who live in this society will enjoy access to the same social and economic rights, good jobs, quality education, housing, health care, clean environment, instability, violence, and crime will continue to be problems that no amount of policing can contain for long. As community-based organizations, civil rights and human rights organizations, and public interest advocacy groups struggle against police brutality and misconduct, the fight to create a new paradigm of policing must necessarily be seen as a part of the broader struggle to create a more just and humane society. Therefore, the demand for police reform and accountability must necessarily be coupled with the demand for public policies that promote social, economic, and racial justice. Our goal must be nothing short of creating a just, humane, and peaceful society. If there is no justice, there will be no peace in these United States of America."
Thanks, Ron. Norman Siegel.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'd like to make one short preliminary statement, not directly on point, and then I'll get to what I'm here to speak on. It's a pleasure to be at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I am a proud graduate of CUNY Brooklyn College. I want to encourage CUNY students and graduates to be all you can be, and do not allow the recent negative comments about CUNY to deter or inhibit any of you from fulfilling your dreams and making a positive impact on this city and the rest of this nation.
Hear, hear.
Police misconduct, excessive force, abuse of authority, discourtesy, racial, ethnic, and homophobic slurs has long been a serious problem with enormous racial overtones in New York City. It is deeply ingrained in police culture. Comments from my fellow panelists tonight all confirm this premise and show how elusive this issue is. More than 3 decades ago, the Kerner Commission reported, and I quote, "In nearly every city it surveyed, the Commission heard complaints of harassment, of social street gatherings and the stopping of blacks on foot or in cars without obvious basis. These, together with contemptuous and degrading abuse, have great impact in the ghetto. Some conduct, breaking up of street groups, indiscriminate stops and searches," what Ron was talking about, "is frequently directed at youths, creating special tensions in areas where youth spend much time on the street." These words, I submit, unfortunately, describe the reality in too many neighborhoods in New York City today. With danger, bitterness, and resignation, law-abiding people bear witness to the unbridled aggressiveness of some police officers. Many residents feel that police misconduct is all too commonplace. I would like to move quickly now to the question of what can we do. The deaths of Amadou Diallo, the torture of Abner Louimer, the deaths of Gideon Bush and Patrick Dorismont, and the consequential mass mobilization in the city, which was truly multiracial, have resulted in a unique historical moment for people of goodwill to come together across racial lines, which is so important, and seize the moment in order to achieve institutional and systemic change within the NYPD. Here are 15 specific recommendations in response to Michael's question of what can we do. 1, we need to create a residency requirement tied to an affirmative action plan for police officers to improve police community relations and to increase the effectiveness of the NYPD. The residency requirement must be tied to affirmative action plan in order to deal with the underrepresentation at the NYPD. We need to support and strengthen the CCRB. 3, as history has told us based on Martha's comments, we need to create an independent special prosecutor for police brutality and corruption. They should not be bifurcated. They go hand in hand. Any analysis or recommendations to set up an agency to do oversight of only corruption, we should reject. They need to be together. You can't allow people to bifurcate it. Special prosecutor, because there's an inherent conflict in the local prosecutors, our district attorneys. They work with the police on an hour-to-hour basis. They rely on the police testimony for their overwhelming percentage of cases that they need to prosecute. There's a built-in conflict of interest. We should not allow the local prosecutors to do this. Second, they need great expertise. If you watched the Amadou Diallo trial in Albany, you saw the failure of the local district attorney's offices because of the lack of resources and expertise with regard to cross-examination, with regard to making motions to bring the jury to the scene of the incident. All of the above leads to the need for an independent special prosecutor with independence, expertise, and resources. Finally, we need to eliminate, when I say finally, the fourth point, to finally, because it's been going on for way, way too long, and I don't know of any jurisdictions in America that have this rule. We have to eliminate the 48-hour rule, where police officers are not required to speak to any NYPD investigators for 48 hours after being identified as people who are suspect for violating NYPD rules and regulations. If I'm a suspect, they're knocking on my door tonight. They're not giving me 48 hours, and the police shouldn't be given the 48 hours as well. 5, improve the kind of training police officers receive at the academy and in individual precincts to include discussions about race relations. On that point, when I was on Mayor Giuliani's task force, which was a public relations ploy. Sounds very similar to the comment you were talking about, that they had that commission in order to get through the mayoral election. It appears, God, that's exactly what he was doing in '97 to get over the election by setting up this commission. But some of us were able to get our hands on documents that we had never seen before, and the material with regard to even the cultural sensitivity training had built in negative racial and cultural stereotypes that had to make you understand why the training was reinforcing a lot of the negative biases that the cops have out on the street, especially about young men of color. We need to create elected police community advisory boards to monitor police activity at the precinct level. We need to work with police officers to advocate for policy changes. This is usually controversial, especially in progressive audiences. We need, in my opinion, to bring the police in to this discussion, and even the PBA, in order to create the program that will bring about the changes. Stereotyping the cops is a mistake. Not involving the cops in the dialogue, not involving the police in designing the steps that have to be taken to ameliorate this problem is self-defeating. For example, increased police pay, improved facilities, the increased use of computers and technology, all of the above would improve police morale, which would ultimately improve community police relations. As I said before, we have to recognize that brutality and corruption are linked. We have to take a hard look at the current psychological testing, both initial screening of candidates and periodic testing of officers. I was shocked to find out that although you get a psych test when you come into the NYPD, there's no psych test thereafter. So Justin Volpe can come in as a good officer, but being out there 5 years, 10 years later, you can be a walking time bomb, and there needs to be a periodic, random psychological testing. There are some civil liberties problems here. I think they can be overcome. It makes no sense to give them a psych test in the beginning and then never bring them in again. We need to adopt incentives for hiring, promotion, and retention of police officers who are fluent in those languages used in the communities where they work. If you're in a community that is speaking Spanish, Asian, Yiddish, whatever, and you have a receptionist who doesn't speak that language, it makes no sense. Incentives, officers tell them if they speak 2 languages, they get a $2,000 bonus. You speak 3 languages, you get a $3,000 bonus, and give them half of the tuition to let them go to places in the CUNY system and be able to learn second and third languages. 4 or 5 more quickies. Increase the use of the NYPD website for dissemination of statistics relevant to police community issues. They're our data, they're not just the NYPD's data. Have the U.S. Justice Department issue an annual report on police misconduct in America, including data from all 50 states. We do it on crime annually, we should do it on police misconduct. Have state attorney generals issue annual reports on police misconduct in their states, including data on a county-wide basis. Tie federal and state funding for police departments to the issue of police misconduct and reporting to both the Justice Department and attorney generals. In conclusion, inherent in the concept of democracy is the notion that we, the people, should have oversight and control over those we empower to use physical and deadly physical force. The abuse suffered by Amna Louimer and the shooting deaths of Amadou Diallo, Gideon Butch, Patrick Dorisman, to name but a few, are troubling police instances that once again offer us an opportunity to bring about fundamental and meaningful improvements in the way we monitor our police, achieving greater accountability over the NYPD and enhancing police community relations. Let us not fail this time. Thank you. Of statistics relevant to police community issues. There are data, they're not just the NYPD's data. Have the U.S. Justice Department issue an annual report on police misconduct in America, including data from all 50 states. We do it on crime annually. We should do it on police misconduct. Have state attorney generals issue annual reports on police misconduct in their states, including data on a county-wide basis. Tie federal and state funding for police departments to the issue of police misconduct and reporting to both the Justice Department and attorney generals. In conclusion, inherent in the concept of democracy is the notion that we, the people, should have oversight and control over those we empower to use physical and deadly physical force. The abuse suffered by Amna Louimer and the shooting deaths of Amadou Diallo, Gideon Butch, Patrick Dorisman, to name but a few, are troubling police instances that once again offer us an opportunity to bring about fundamental and meaningful improvements in the way we monitor our police, achieving greater accountability over the NYPD and enhancing police-community relations. Let us not fail this time. Thank you.
Now, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, but first I'm going to turn it over to me, possession of the microphone being what it is. And I want to pose a question to all of the panelists by way of giving them a chance to respond to what the other panelists have put out. And it's a question that actually disturbs me, that grows out of the sequence of discussions that we have had. Norman put his finger on it with the question of nothing seems to have changed. And as Lynn was talking about a litany of police investigations from the 1890s on and the defeat of reform efforts very much akin to what we've been talking about just now under Mayor Gaynor's administration. How many people ever heard of Mayor Gaynor? But I saw people nodding, aha. And then when Martha was giving the discussion of events in the 40s and 50s, there was an eerie and depressing familiarity to those events. And I have the feeling that this built as, in fact, the sessions wore on. And I'd like to raise a question, which is basically comes down to, hasn't, in fact, something changed? One thing that strikes me, and again, this is why I'm concerned about the issue of labeling, of calling it police brutality, and many people were using other words on the panel this evening. My concern with that expression is that it does tend to focus our attention on the police themselves, an important part of the component, no doubt, but it sounds as if it's a characterological flaw that these people are, predisposed for questions of race and other psychological deficiencies to, whacking hell out of people. I'm concerned that that misses the question of what is it that the police have been asked to do in this city and by the larger society? What structures of racial, cultural, political, and economic authority have they been deputed to uphold? And one thing that strikes me is that something which is not on our agenda tonight is, in fact, police violence in labor relations. And for any of you who know anything about the history of those issues in the country at large and in New York City, it's an astonishing transformation.